guys, Clinton from GrimmSpeed here, and I'm going to be walking you through the installation of the GrimmSpeed Front Mount Intercooler for the 15 Plus Subaru WRX platform. This is a moderately in-depth install, so I would carve out a few hours to get the job done. Here is a rough idea of the tools that you will need to complete the job. Now let's get started. Begin the process by popping your hood. We will need to remove the intake snorkel, the cover for the engine, the top mount intercooler, as well as the front bumper. Let's start there. Remove the clips and screws holding the trim on the top of the bumper. Move on to the engine cover. There are two flathead clips on the top, left, and right of the engine cover. With those clips removed, firmly pull up on the bottom of the engine cover until it pops off. Then place it aside. Now let's tackle the OEM intercooler. There are mounting screws on each side of the intercooler that need to be loosened and removed. The couplers on the inlet and outlet of the intercooler need to be taken off as well. There is a bracket on the right side of the intercooler that also needs to be removed. You will reuse the bolts, so keep those close for later use. With the bracket removed and the couplers loosened, you should be able to pull the intercooler out of the engine bay. Once that's done, there's a bracket underneath the intercooler that can be removed as well. With the intercooler removed, this is what your bay should look like now, nice and open. Now let's move underneath the car. This next step involves removing the splash guard. This can be done by removing the bolts and clips holding it on. The next step is to remove the skid plate. Use your 12mm socket wrench to remove the 4 bolts. Now we need to remove the bumper. There are 2 pop clips on the underside of the bumper and 1 pop clip in the wheel well. Grab the bumper firmly from the wheel well and carefully pry the bumper off the front of the car, being careful not to break the clips. It may be a good idea to have a second person handy to help you with this. Once the clips are loose from the sides, the bumper should come off in the front pretty easily. You will have to disconnect the turn signal lights. You can do this in one of 2 ways, by either removing the bulb from the housing or unplugging the connection. Find the bolts that hold the OEM bumper bar to the car and remove them from both sides. Lift the bumper bar off and place aside. There are a couple things we need to do in order to make clearance for the new front mount core. One of them is to flip this sensor around so it faces the other direction. The next step is going to be removing the washer fluid reservoir so we can get to the bolts behind it. With the reservoir out of the way, use a 14mm socket wrench to remove these two bolts. Also remove the two bolts at the front. Remove the brace and set aside. Now reattach the reservoir in the same way you took it off. Next, we will need to remove the two pieces of foam from the front of the car. You can use a flathead screwdriver to pry the clip from the hole. At this point, we are very close to being able to install the intercooler core on the front of the car. We need to trim two of the plastic pieces on the splash guard to make room for the core. Using an X-Acto knife, carefully cut these plastic pieces as shown here. Do the same for the other side. The time has almost come to install your new front mount. But before we do so, we need to install the 3 steel mounting brackets that came with your kit. Loosely install the brackets as shown. At this point, it might be nice to have a second pair of hands. Find these mounting holes and use the included hardware to mount the intercooler. Using an 8mm socket or a flathead screwdriver, loosen the worm clamp on the turbo inlet. With a little bit of force, the pipe should pop off the inlet. You can then tuck it behind the engine. Next, loosen the worm clamp on the bypass valve. Now we want to take the inlet off of the turbo. This can be done by removing the two 10mm bolts from the turbo housing. At this point, you want to be extremely careful because you do not want to strip the bolts on the turbo housing. Now we need to remove the flange for the charge pipe. Use a 10mm wrench to take these bolts out. Once the flange is loose, take it and push it up so it's out of the way. We will come back to it later. Now we need to install the GrimmSpeed pipe flange. Make sure that when you are installing this flange, the O-ring is included. Using a 13mm wrench, install these two bolts. In order to make the installation of the inlet as easy as possible, orientate your two worm clamps like shown here. Slip the silicone onto the flange like this, making sure you push the silicone all the way down onto the flange. Also make sure that the worm clamp is also pressed all the way down onto the flange. The end result should look something like this. Now that that's done, we can reinstall the turbo inlet and push the bypass valve back into place and tighten the worm clamp. When installing the inlet back onto the turbo, we suggest that you hand tighten the bolts first. This will ensure that you do not strip the threads in the bolt hole. Find one of the two diagonal couplers, which has a larger end and a smaller end. We will use these for the intercooler inlet and outlet. Your kit should include 3 large clamps and 8 of the smaller clamps. Slip 1 large and 1 small worm clamp over the coupler so they stay in place. Then slip a medium-sized clamp over the turbo outlet adapter. This is the pipe you will be using for this section. The short end will go into the intercooler, while the long end will go into the turbo outlet adapter hole. The pipe features a bead roll, which helps with sealing and clamp placement. When placing your clamp, make sure it sits directly behind the bead roll. Use the same technique for the bead roll on the intercooler inlet. Now you can tighten the clamp on the turbo outlet adapter. Now reattach the intake piping. In order to button this side up, we will need to cut a hole in the wheel well material so the piping will fit. What Chase is doing here is cutting down the plastic behind the mounting point, then making another cut 2.5 inches over to make room for the pipe. When you have that cut, bolt the plastic back into place using the OEM hardware. It's up to you if you want to cut the excess plastic. We chose to keep it. Moving back to the engine bay, it's time to remove the charge pipe. You've already loosened the bolts, so all that needs to be done now is to pull it out of the engine bay. Find another angled coupler along with a medium and large size clamp and press it onto your throttle body. Keep the clamps loose for now. We will adjust them later. Using this pipe, press it into the throttle body coupler. The bracket on the pipe should align with the mounting points on the manifold. You may need to twist the coupler in order to get it to fit correctly. Use the OEM hardware to secure the pipe in place. Keep everything relatively loose for now. When you've gotten to a point that you're comfortable with how it's sitting, go back and tighten the clamps on the throttle body. Again, you want to make sure that the clamp is sitting just before the bead on the pipe. Your kit comes with a short piece of splitter bulb that needs to go on the pinch weld in front of the battery. This will help protect the pipe from getting damaged and scratched during the installation process. Grab one of the straight couplers and 2 medium-sized clamps and fit them on to the end of the piping. The shorter end of this pipe will go into the coupler on top, while the other end receives a 90-degree coupler. Press the coupler on about an inch or so and point it in a down direction. So to make this part a little bit easier, separate the top of the washer fluid spout from the bottom and push the bottom part to the side. Maneuver the pipe down into the space coupler first. Then attach the pipe to the upper coupler. Slide a clamp onto the coupler from the bottom and position it so it's easily reachable. Find this short pipe in your kit and push the long end of it into the coupler. Then position this pipe so it points towards the intercooler. Slide another clamp onto the bottom of the coupler, making sure that it sits directly below the bead. Find the last angled coupler along with the worm clamps and install them onto the intercooler. Twist the coupler so it lines up with the piping and push the piping into the coupler. Once everything is positioned correctly, go ahead and tighten the clamps. Now let's go back up to the engine bay and place and tighten these worm clamps on this coupler. Now it's just a matter of going around the engine bay and checking each connection to make sure it's tight and secure. Your hardware kit also includes a small piece of Tech Flex wire loom and a couple zip ties. Use these items to protect against wear and tear on this rubber hose that rubs against the new intercooler piping. Running a bumper bar on this kit is optional, although we do highly suggest it. If you do decide to run a GrimmSpeed bumper bar, installation is fairly easy. We will have to go back a few steps. With the intercooler piping installed, it is hard to reach the mounting points for the bumper bar. Therefore, we will have to loosen the worm clamps on the driver's side of the intercooler. That should give you enough room to mount the bumper bar using the OEM hardware. Mounting the bumper after the installation of the GrimmSpeed Front Mount Intercooler should be relatively easy. If everything is installed correctly, the front bumper should fit directly over the front mount without any need to cut or trim. Make sure to plug the bulbs back into the turn signal housings and be careful to not break any of the bumper clips. Reinstall your skid plate, splash guard, and top bumper trim. And there you have it. The installation of the GrimmSpeed Front Mount Intercooler for the 15 Plus WRX platform is done. Enjoy your kit. If you have any questions, feel free to give us a call or reach out to us via email at support@grimmspeed.com.